Well, welcome to you all to the Manchester CCJ event for this evening on God's Unfailing Word. And I'm thrilled you've been able to join us for this very special event, which embraces not just the whole of the United Kingdom from people who have signed up over the last week and a half, but also Jerusalem. And we welcome especially tonight Bishop Michael Ipgrave from Lichfield, Rabbi David Rosen from Jerusalem from his study. It's 7:30 Israeli time right now. And Sister Teresa Brittain from Prestwich, giving us insight into these issues from a Catholic perspective. I have muted everybody so that we can hear each other. That sounds a paradox, but that's how Zoom sometimes works. What we hope to do is for you to engage with the event this evening, treat it a little bit like a webinar, so that as our speakers speak, please put questions of clarification into the chat, and we'll either look at them straight away or at the end of what each person has said. And then the big questions for discussion that you'd like to raise and engage with our speakers on, you can put those into the chat as well, and we'll bring those into play later in the evening. I want to be sure that everybody has the chance to contribute something, and that using the chat is the fairest way of doing that. We're going to be recording this evening as well, so if there is any aspect of what's said you'd like to have reference to later, I hope, depending on the quality of the recording, we'll be able to give you access to that. So I can introduce you to some of the background staff as well, helping us. Francesca Fraser-Davis, our secretary, is letting people in and out this evening, and will also help me look at the chat as we go through this evening. And my Oppo, the co-chair of the Manchester branch of CCJ, David Arnold, will be saying a few words before we finish this evening as well. So that's what we're going to do this evening. Also Francesca may give us some advice on how to use Zoom as we go through the evening too. Well, let me first introduce both Bishop Michael and Rabbi David, I should mention, are members of the Anglican Jewish Commission, who advise on an annual study engagement between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the two chief rabbis of the State of Israel. And they actually had their preparation meeting in Manchester a couple of years ago. They know each other well, and you can be guaranteed this evening to have people engaged at the heart of Anglican Jewish dialogue, reflecting together on this very important document of the Church of England to put together, God's Unfailing Word. Let me introduce to you first Bishop Michael Ipgrave, who's been Bishop of Lichfield since the year 2016. He chairs the Board of Trustees for CCJ, and he chaired the group of people who researched and compiled God's Unfailing Word. He brings to these roles significant expression, significant experience, both of the Church of England and of interfaith engagement. In the 1990s, he was interfaith advisor and chaplain to the Diocese of Leicester and the Bishop of Leicester, and he became the interfaith advisor to the Archbishop's Council in the year 2001. It's the forerunner of the role that we know today as the Archbishop of Canterbury Secretary for Interreligious Affairs. And in that role, he produced the last attempt that the Church of England made in writing a document that outlined our relationship with and dependence upon Judaism, a document called Sharing One Hope, with a question mark at the end. He was Archdeacon of Southwark from the year 2004, becoming Bishop of Woolwich in 2012, and was awarded an OBE for his interfaith work in London in New Year's Honours in 2011. So Bishop Michael, welcome. One other thing you may not know about Bishop Michael is that he's a mathematician. His first degree is in mathematics at Oriel College in Oxford, but he went on, as any mathematician might, attracted to do a PhD in the Trinity. And that's all about squaring circles and the meaning of language. And he did that under the supervision of Durham University on Trinity and interfaith dialogue, plenitude and plurality. So that's a great introduction to the issues that we're going to be looking at this evening. Bishop Michael, over to you, and I shall unmute you. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, I think I am unmuted because that wonderful yellow square has appeared around my screen. Steve, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and it's lovely to be virtually in Manchester and with David and Francesca, and a particular joy to be with David and Teresa on this webinar, and lovely to see so many familiar faces on the screen too. And I can promise you that I will spare you my ruminations on Trinitarian theology, unless we run out of other things to say, which I very, very much doubt. I would like to, going first, I think if I can just present a little bit about this report, God's Unfailing Word, Theological and Practical Perspectives on Christian-Jewish Relations, published by the Church of England's Faith and Order Commission in the autumn of 2019. So just a couple of years ago. I will endeavour, with the support of your prayers at various points, to share my screen just so you can see one or two of the statements which it makes, because I think sometimes those are easier to take in when you see them rather than just hear them read. So we'll hope we will cross that bridge when we get to it. When we published the report, just something which I thought was quite significant to say about it, as a way of modelling dialogue, although this is clearly a report from the Church of England and particularly concerns the Church of England, we included within it, in the same publication, an afterword from the Chief Rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, in which he engaged both warmly, appreciatively and quite robustly critically with the report. But we wanted to fold the dialogue into the original publication, as it were. And what is the report? Well, in different ways and at various times, to paraphrase the Epistle to the Hebrews, the Church of England over the years has produced a number of statements and reports on Christian-Jewish relations. Steve mentioned Sharing One Hope, ? The last of those, and I still bear the scars of that. God's Unfailing Word does not have a question mark. This particular report began from an idea of Guy Wilkinson, who I see on these screens, that we could gather together the various bits and pieces that the Church of England has said over the years about Christian-Jewish relations, kind of put it all together with sellotape and produce a report which would be kind of quite easy to understand. Well, you can imagine what happened in that process. The project grew in complexity and in length. And what we now have, for the first time, we think, is, having built on that pre-existing material and expanded it, a teaching document that sets out the Church of England's position, or in some cases, range of positions in the area of Christian-Jewish relations. We begin with a very clear principle. There are a number of principles which underpin this report, and this is the first one, which I hope will now appear on your screens. That's preliminary to formulating a principle. I'll do that. Yes. The Christian-Jewish relationship is a gift of God to the Church, which is to be received with care, respect, and gratitude, so that we may learn more fully about God's purposes for us and all the world. In other words, that this specific relationship between Christians and Jews is generative of Christian identity. I'll say a bit more about that later. The Church of England has a very wide range of experiences and views within it, as you will know. We are often, and I think rightly, described as a messy church. And so the methodology of that is reflected, or the methodology of the report reflects some of that diversity. At those times where it is difficult, or indeed impossible, to discern the Church of England's position on some issues, we choose rather to map out a number of positions held with integrity by Anglicans. But this is not simply saying that anything goes. We also identify an outer limit to some questions beyond which we think that views are not acceptable within the Church of England. And at times we point to a core position on which we in fact can all agree. So another of our principles in this report states that careful discernment is needed as to where Christians should be able to agree on clear affirmations, where a range of positions that can be held with integrity can be identified, and where there is a responsibility to challenge views expressed by some within the church. And I think that's important to bear in mind, particularly when we get to some of the contentious issues with which God's unfailing word deals. We also, of course, recognise that there is enormous diversity within the Jewish community too, and that a conversation needs to go on between us about this. In the words of another of the principles of this report, Christians have a responsibility to ensure that whatever they may say about Judaism is informed by continuing dialogue with Jewish people. It is important to listen carefully and with discernment to the range of voices of Jewish people themselves. And of course, that is integral to how Christian dialogue proceeds, and if I might say as Chair of Trustees, integral to what we try to do within the Council of Christians and Jews in particular. Just to give you what I think nowadays is often called a roadmap through the report, this is its structure in two parts, beginning with something about theological frameworks for the Christian-Jewish relationship, partly a mapping of a difficult history, and then identifying within that a distinctive relationship of Christians and Jews compared to the relationship that Christians have with any other community. And then we move into some more practical or applied areas, what we've called critical issues, of which there are many, but we pick out 4 clusters in particular, which you can see there: mission and evangelism, teaching and preaching, the land of Israel, ethical discernment, and common action. So that's the shape of the report. I'm not going to go through all that ground in detail, you'll be glad to know. What I want to do now for my remaining time really is to set out something a little more personal on how I understand Christian-Jewish relationships in light of the position set out, or positions set out, in God's unfailing word. And I want to make 3 points really. It seems to me that for Jewish people, Christianity, and these are the things which God's unfailing word is emphasizing, Christianity is indubitably dangerous, it is irreducibly particular, and it is irreversibly missional. And I recognise that each of those has quite a lot of contentious charge to it. Firstly, to say it's indubitably dangerous, by this I mean that Christianity has the potential to cause great damage to Jewish people and Jewish communities. And of course, we know that is the case because historically that is what has happened. Such damage has been caused. As God's unfailing word puts it, Christians have been guilty of promoting and fostering negative stereotypes of Jewish people that have contributed to grave suffering and injustice. They therefore have a duty to be alert to the continuation of such stereotyping and to resist it. And that's in no sense, as you know, breaking new ground. The historical evidence for that is overwhelming and well known. The long and virulent tradition of the enseignement du mépris, that as Christians we need to acknowledge and repent of ecclesial complicity in the evils of anti-Semitism. But more than repentance is needed, we also are called to walk in newness of life, recognizing that there is another way. So alongside that recognition of the need to repentance, we claim, with some boldness, but we claim that Christianity also has the potential to be the antidote to anti-Semitism, without being any less Christian, indeed through being more authentically Christian. Truthful thinking and right action with regard to Christian-Jewish relations follow from the faith which is revealed and set forth in the Catholic creeds and to which the historic formularies of the Church of England bear witness. That's a little bit of Church of England kind of gobbledygook, or inner speak, I should say. They do not undermine or dilute it. So Christianity can be the antidote to this if we understand it right. And the history undoubtedly makes us see ourselves in a new light, or it might be better to say to see ourselves in a new shadow. Anti-Judaism in the Christian tradition has been particularly damaging because of the relationship which it has created, which is endlessly discussed, but is undoubtedly there, with secular anti-Semitism. It helped to prepare that, and we know that that culminated in the Shoah. And for me as a Christian, perhaps for all of us as a Christian, this is a painful thing to come to terms with. It is painful to recognise the shadow side of the teachings of great Christians of the past. And just to pick fairly much at random 3 whose spiritual influence is important for me personally: John Chrysostom, Martin Luther, and Bernard of Clairvaux. All of them fail at the bar of anti-Judaism. How do we cope with the realization of this shadow side? And does that reach right back into our scriptures, into the New Testament itself? That is a tangled and a painful question. But whatever answer we give to that, and there's quite a lot of discussion of that in God's Unfailing Word, I think we cannot approach our scriptures, and still less our church's traditions, unaware of the need for caution and vigilance and humility. You could say that we have lost our innocence in the way that we read Christian history. We can no longer see that as, I think I grew up really seeing it as basically hagiography. And that's not just looking to the past. We also need to reflect on our present ways of teaching and preaching, on some of the hymns and the worship songs that we sing, on the prayers that we use at different times in the Christian year, and so forth. The Archbishop of Canterbury has referred to anti-Semitism as a virus which is constantly mutating into different forms. We still see it in its original form in some places, but this virus can change. We all talk about variants nowadays, and attach itself to new hosts. And particularly, of course, today, we see some of the language that appearing in some of the language used around the conflict in Israel-Palestine, including some of the language used within some of our churches. That is a hugely complex and contested area. You don't need me to tell you that, and you will not be surprised to know that the most difficult chapter to write in this report was chapter 5, headed "The Land of Israel." Undoubtedly, when people feel passionately about this matter, sometimes they do reach down into anti-Judaic and anti-Semitic tropes. I'm very glad that during the process of writing this report, really, the College of Bishops of the Church of England adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. I know that that is contested, but it does provide something of a benchmark for us. So indubitably dangerous, and the need for vigilance and confrontation with anti-Semitism. Secondly, Christianity in its relationship to Israel is irreducibly particular. And of course, over the last 50 years or so, we've become much more aware of that, and we should always have been aware of it. But the rediscovery of the Jewishness of Jesus and a renewed emphasis on the Jewish origins of Christianity, I think remind us that this is, for us in the Church of England, for us in the Christian Church, is a relationship like no other. You can see, I'm not going to read that long quotation there, but it highlights some of the ways in which Judaism operates in a completely different way in relation to Christianity than any other faith, I think. And also the way in which the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is characterized both by kinship and by divergence. And it was so much easier if it was just one or the other, but it is both, and that's what we have to make sense of. I think one of the consequences of that for me is that we need to think carefully what we mean when we speak of Christianity as a universal religion. as we sometimes do. I don't think we can just say that in the sense that, you know, we're universal, bigger is better. That sort of approach can easily lead, and has led, to triumphalism and to the obliteration of difference. And we need to be really aware of that danger, especially when universal is really just used as a cloak for the values of modern Western consumer capitalism. I think, in fact, that the church in this country, certainly the Church of England, can come to have a clearer perspective on this, precisely as we are becoming more marginal to our societies, and so learn to appreciate more deeply the long diaspora Jewish experience of distinctive living as a minority. For us, it's not just any kind of universality. Universality, for me anyway, must be irreducibly rooted in the particularism of the historical story that begins with the God of Abraham choosing and delivering a people. And the story of Jesus only makes sense within that story and cannot be detached from it, as Vatican II in Nostra Aetate made so very eloquently clear. We cannot understand who we are as a church except in relationship with Judaism. And the sad fact is that our contemporary church in practice often devalues that particularity, as you can see from the widespread disparagement or sometimes neglect of the Hebrew scriptures in church life. There is a kind of functional Marcionism in Western church life. Remembering Marcion's the heretic, the early Christian heretic who wanted to remove the Hebrew scriptures and quite a lot of the New Testament as well from the canon. So the report is making, is urging a rediscovery of the Jewish groundedness of Christianity in our own internal life as a church. And having said that, and the distinctiveness of this relationship, I think the particularity of that relationship also has implications for our involvement in all interfaith relations. If this is our significant other from the beginning, then the way in which we respond to people in other faith communities will also be imprinted with this first relationship. And we quote the wonderful, I think it's wonderful, I fought quite hard to get this into the report because some people didn't know what it meant, and maybe that's part of it. There's a wonderful quotation from Walter Cardinal Caspar, who says that Judaism is a sacrament of every otherness, that as such the church must learn to discern, recognize, and celebrate. In other words, the Jewish-Christian relationship for us has a paradigmatic significance, not an exceptional distinctiveness, but a paradigmatic distinctiveness. In every encounter with the other, and particularly with a religious other, we are taken back to the encounter with Israel, which is formative for the Christian story. I'm pushing my time limit, but I'm going to go on for a few more minutes if I may, and if I may not, no doubt I shall be muted. I want to finally just say a little bit, sorry, save that for later, about missionality, the sense that Christianity is irreversibly missional. And this is a difficult thing to say, well, a contested thing to say. Mission is a difficult and sometimes seen as an embarrassing area in Christian Jewish relations, and it's very easy to see why that is the case. Aggressive proselytism and forced conversions and fear, and in some cases the actuality of the destruction of Jewish identity, have all been part of the mission history. And we know that we need to be very sensitive to the charge of theological aggression, particularly after the Shoah, and to recognize and confess that much Christian evangelism has been coercive, manipulative, and disrespectful of Jewish identity. And God's Unfailing Word makes those points very forcefully. But we cannot simply bracket out mission entirely. Mission is, in some sense, fundamental to Christian self-understanding, because Christianity is not about the reception of an inheritance. It is about alignment with a story, and a story wants to be shared with others. In other words, the mission impulse in Christianity is deep-seated and constitutive of who we are as Christians, I believe. And God's unfailing word has one of its most complex, the uncharitable might say convoluted passages at this point, as it tries to map out the range of views on this subject held within the Church of England, the outer boundaries of what is acceptable within that range, and where the centre of gravity might be held to lie within that range. I would say that the deep-seated impulse to mission, which is there in Christianity, does not need to be directed solely or even principally, or maybe even at all, towards Jewish people. We are now in a very different place, both as Christians and as Jews, to where we were in previous periods of our history. We are, both of us, as Jews and Christians, in a religiously diverse and a secularizing world where our values can be shared with a society drifting from God. And that, for me, is one of the senses of mission, and it is one expressed in a document produced by the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops in 1988, which is quoted by the report, The Way of Dialogue. Jews, Muslims and Christians have a common mission. They share a mission to the world, that God's name may be honoured. Hallowed be your name. In other words, mission is not just or mainly about seeking to convert people from one faith to another. And maybe it is something which can be shared, though the report does, as I say, recognise that there is a diversity of views on that question in the Church of England. And of course, there is a diversity of views between Christians and Jews about that. How far is it realistic for Christians and Jews to speak the language of mission together? Well, it's not surprising, for all the history that we know, that the associations of missional language in Judaism are predominantly negative. But let me just give you this quotation from that 2015 document from an influential group of Orthodox rabbis on Jewish-Christian relations. I think, Rabbi David, you were one of the signatories of this, as I recall. And look at the language that is used here. I've put some dots in just to make the point. We Jews can acknowledge the ongoing constructive validity of Christianity as our partner in world redemption, without any fear that this will be exploited for missionary purposes. ... Neither of us can achieve God's mission in this world alone. And within that one paragraph, you can see the word mission being used in two very different ways, it seems to me, or two very different sets of associations. And the second use, which speaks of achieving God's mission in this world, is pretty closely aligned to the modern Christian view, contemporary Christian view of Missio Dei, of mission as sharing in God's work in the world. And in fact, to do the will of our Father in heaven goes on to say both Jews and Christians have a common covenantal mission to perfect the world under the sovereignty of the Almighty. So I think there is scope for a conversation around mission. I hope that our relationship with the Jewish people, which, as I say, is constitutive for who we are as Christians, can also help to awaken us as Christians to a deeper sense of what our mission is. To work that out in practice is a conversation between Christians and Jews, which is always only just beginning. But we do know now that the conversation can be conducted in a spirit of friendship and of trust, which many of our precursors did not enjoy. I rest my case, Your Honour.
Mr. Michael, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful introduction to God's unfailing word. John Courtney Murray said, "I don't know what I've said until I understand what you've heard." And we're going to hear now how Rabbi David Rosen hears what we have just had presented to us. Rabbi David Rosen is a former Chief Rabbi of Ireland. He's the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee and Director of its Heilbronn Institute for International Interreligious Understanding. He's a past chairman of the IJCIC, the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and a member of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Commission for Interreligious Dialogue. He serves on the Council of the Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. He began Rabbis for Human Rights, I think many years ago, honorary president of ICCJ, and as a member of the Bilateral Commission of the State of Israel and the Holy See that negotiated the fundamental agreement between the two, leading to the Vatican recognizing the State of Israel and full bilateral relations in 1994. 11 years later, he was given a papal knighthood, made a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great for his contribution to promoting Catholic-Jewish reconciliation, and in 2010 was made CBE, a Commander of the British Empire, for his contributions to interfaith relations, and awarded the Archbishop of Canterbury's Hubert Walter Award for Reconciliation Interfaith Cooperation 5 years ago. And that's just a few things, because Rabbi David has many other involvements in international interfaith bodies where he represents the Jewish community at very, very senior level. And it's a great honor to have you with us tonight, Rabbi David. He's also a fellow vegetarian, if I can wave the flag for a brief moment.
Vegan.
Vegan, even vegan. Right, thank you.
Yes.
Rabbi David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Steve. It is an honor for me to be with you all and to see so many dear friends on the screen and to be participating in this discussion. Allow me, first of all, to express my profound appreciation and admiration for this document, which I think is an impressive work, and especially in terms of what in Hebrew is called a cheshbon nefesh, a reckoning of the soul, a very profound and sincere reflection on a tragic history. It's not, this of course, as Bishop Michael has already said, is a Christian document written for a Christian audience. And therefore it's not really for me to offer a critique, even though that's what I've been asked to do. But one thing at least I do feel comfortable about saying, and that is what I think is lacking from a Jewish perspective. Allow me to reveal that I was involved in some initial consultation, thanks above all to Guy Wilkinson, which I deeply appreciated. But understandably, I wasn't around, as I'm not based in the UK. I'm here in Jerusalem, and therefore was not involved in seeing the final text, which I actually only saw when it was sent to me by the Office of the Chief Rabbi in London. As again, I think it's a wonderful document. What I'm struck by is that while I'm delighted to see that Bishop Michael refers to the document from 2015 to do the will of our Father in heaven, this document, this particular text, doesn't refer to that at all. Its only point of reference is Dabru Emet, which was an important document, but Dabru Emet didn't go anywhere near as far as to do the will of our Father in heaven, nor did it go as far as a document which in some ways is even more significant in terms of, if you like, the Jewish establishment standing behind it. And that's a document between Jerusalem and Rome, which was published in 2017. Now, both of those documents, I think, should have been referred to within God's unfailing word. And particularly, I say this as an Orthodox rabbi, because while respecting very much the contribution of my liberal colleagues from the Reform, Conservative, liberal movements to the whole endeavor of Jewish-Christian dialogue, if we want to be heard, then we need to be able to make reference to those who are the official authorities with regards to the members of the Jewish community. And certainly the majority in Britain, in the UK, and obviously with regards to Israel, in terms of those who define themselves as religious, identify themselves as Orthodox. So to do the will of our Father in heaven is an Orthodox document, though one could fairly say it's coming from the more liberal sections of Orthodoxy. But between Jerusalem and Rome is a document that was produced and signed onto by the Conference of European Rabbis, the Orthodox representative body in Europe, the Rabbinical Council of America, the Orthodox body in North America, and the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. That's what makes it such a remarkable document. And not to refer to it, I think, is a significant lacuna, and I think simply does disservice to our long-term goal of God's unfailing word if it seeks to be able to find resonance within the Jewish community. So I was asked 3 questions by Steve. How may Christians own up to their different history, to comment on particularly the issues of supersessionism, replacement theology, and mission, and how may Christians respond to these particular challenges, which again is a little bit presumptuous on my part, and then finally to talk about building relationships. So with regards to how Christians may own up to their difficult history, here again I say, I don't think you can do very much better than take the words of this remarkable document to heart. Obviously, there are the areas that it does allude to, most notably education, and never allowing ourselves to forget the responsibility of the past, though not allowing that to be the overwhelming factor in determining the present. In other words, our relationship must not be based upon guilt, but nevertheless, which is not a healthy basis for a relationship, but nevertheless, it does require us to teach future generations of what can go wrong and what has gone wrong, and therefore to ensure that we are always on our guard. And then there is the area of preaching, which the document refers to. There's a beautiful document that was produced by the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference for Holy Week and for the Triduum, called In Context, and I think that says it all. I think when one, as the document itself indicates, when one understands the texts in context, then one is able to look at them in a very different way, to be able to see debates as debates within the family as they were at the time of Jesus and his disciples, rather than, of course, as was the case for the majority of our history, Christians seeing Jesus as somebody outside the Jewish community. And then also, as the document mentions, their commemorations. So if churches and different Christian organizations participate in commemorations that recall the failures of the past, I think then we are can be much more confident with regards to the future. So with regards to supersession and replacement theology, I think in my limited understanding, replacement theology is an unquestionable problem. Supersessionism seems a little more fuzzy, because if replacement theology actually means replacing the Jewish people, then that's denying our heritage, if not, if you want, from our perspective, stealing it. But the issue of supersessionism, I think, can be understood in 2 different ways. There is the one way, which of course I think we would all find unacceptable, to be able to see Judaism as some kind of living fossil, as again, God's unfailing word refers to it. But there is another way of seeing supersessionism, and that is to be able to see Christianity as a fulfillment of Judaism, which obviously is problematic from a Jewish perspective, but I don't think it's quite as offensive. I recall a conversation I had with Pope Benedict XVI before he was Pope Benedict XVI, when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger in charge of doctrine and faith, and he was visiting here in Jerusalem. And he actually was a good friend of the late mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, and I utilized my contacts with Teddy to arrange a meeting with Cardinal Ratzinger. because I really wanted to understand him, understand his approach towards the Jewish people and our relationship. He said some fascinating things to me. He said to me, you are our roots, and therefore anything that has religious validity for you must have religious validity for us. Well, that opened up an enormous box of discussion. But to cut this long story short, because I could just tell you about this conversation alone in the time that I have at my disposal, I said to him, well, Your Eminence, if I've understood you correctly, you say that we Jews, if we are loyal to Torah, we are going to heaven. But we won't have class 1A seats. Those are reserved for the good Catholics. So he laughed and he said, well, I wouldn't put it that way. But the fact that he wouldn't put it that way means that that's exactly what he thought. And I think that is quite widespread. And as I say, I don't think that is something that is so offensive. In other words, an attitude that sees us as not fully complete is problematic, but I think this is something we can live with. Obviously, I would prefer Christians to have an approach that would be more in consonance with what God's unfailing word seems to suggest is not acceptable to most Christians, and that is the idea of a double covenant or a complexity of covenant, which it seems to me that Bishop Michael was alluding to. In that sense, maybe expressing a minority view that didn't reflect the majority of the compilers of God's unfailing word. The issue of mission, which he has already referred to, again, I think that the text, God's Unfailing Word, is lacking a little bit here. It does affirm that Jews see mission in a sense of proselytizing or as a threat, that it's perceived as threatening. But it's perceived as threatening, and I think the document doesn't make this clear, not just because of our vulnerability, which the document acknowledges. It's not just a matter of our vulnerability. What is lacking, I think, is the failure to clarify the essence of Jewish identity, which is that we are a people born out of a religion and a religion born out of the people. These things are inextricable. And embracing another religion, therefore, is seen within, if you like, the most deeply rooted segments of our community as an act of betrayal. And especially in terms of our history, because this was something with which Jews, when we talk of Jewish martyrdom, primarily in the Jewish consciousness, we are thinking of those who were challenged to adjure their own tradition in order to embrace, in particular, the Christian affirmation. So it's not just a matter of being vulnerable. It's a matter of understanding that proselytizing, calling on Jews to embrace a religious identity that is not the traditional Jewish religious identity, is seen as an act of betrayal in the community. Without that understanding, I don't think that one can be adequately sensitive to the complexity involved. Now, how might Christians respond to this? Well, there is one approach which is alluded to within God's Unfailing Word, and that is, if you like, in light of history, or more correctly, in the shadow of history, to say, well, in terms of what's gone, it's not really appropriate. And even therefore, if you do believe that Jews still at some stage in God's mystery have to come to acknowledgement of the salvific message of Christianity, one could say, I believe, and I believe I would even argue one should say, in the shadow of everything that's happened, we have a certain responsibility to accept a moratorium with regards to the Jewish people and leave ultimately the resolution of this conundrum, as indeed Paul himself did, as referred to in the text, in God's hands. But there could be other ways of looking at this. As I say, aside from looking at the double covenant or different parts of one covenant or the complexity of covenant, one could set aside the issue of truth claims and look at the relationship in a manner which actually Pope Francis has done implicitly, but with very interesting language. He uses the term in his encyclical, the first one that he brought out, relating also to the Jewish community. He uses the term complementarity. And complementarity offers us perhaps a different way to approach the nature of relationship. As I say, perhaps leaving the issue of truth claims in the hands of the one source and the only totality of truth, and look at ways in which we can be seen as complementing one another in the divine economy, as it were. So, for example, seeing the importance of Christian understanding of personal salvation in relation to the Jewish collective understanding of salvation. Conscious of the Christian message that the kingdom in some way is here, and yet the Jewish insistence that it's not, at least not fully, and the importance of these particular dimensions. Perhaps also Judaism serves for Christianity as an admission against the dangers and the sins of triumphalism, but Christianity perhaps should serve as a loving but constant warning to the Jewish community of the dangers of ethnocentricity. Even perhaps the other way round with the modern world, one might be able to see Christianity's concept of personal salvation as giving something very important for the individual within an alienated world, but Judaism's collective identity being perhaps more suited for the multicultural context in which we live today. So these are perhaps areas in which we could reflect how to see our relationship in a different paradigm, not in terms of the competition, but more in terms of the complementarity. Finally, in terms of building relationships, again, I think that the document has some wonderful insights. Perhaps it would have been nice if the document would not just refer to God's unfailing word, but also refer to God's fidelity with regards to Israel. In other words, without taking any kind of political stand on Israel, nevertheless to see the return of the Jewish people and to rebuild Jewish life in the land as a manifestation of God's faithfulness, his fidelity precisely to his covenant in that context. That didn't seem to me to be quite explicit within the document, unless I'm mistaken. There are wonderful initiatives that have been taken, and of course I would refer particularly to not only the work of the Council of Christians and Jews, which in itself is of course the most important response, building understanding and friendship between Jews and Christians, but also to initiatives like another member of our bilateral joint Anglican Jewish Commission, Jane Clements, has initiated the organization FODIP, because the issue of Israel can become so neuralgic and problematic that to facilitate open, genuine conversation is really very necessary. And perhaps we might also consider ways in which Jews and Christians can work together on joint projects, especially in the Holy Land, particularly those that relate to the well-being of Christians in the Holy Land, who are caught very much between the hammer and the anvil, minority within minority. And I think that joint initiatives on the part of Jewish communities and Christian communities taking care of those who need particular attention in the Holy Land could have a very salutary impact. Let me finally just return to just the question of mission again. Again, Bishop Michael actually touched on this, but let me go one stage further. There is a problem here with language, of course, and even as indeed his reference to do the will of our Father in heaven indicated, the word mission itself and missionary is used in many different ways. But we need to be aware of the fact that mission to the Jews, or missionizing in relation to the Jews, is seen by Jews as synonymous with proselytizing. And therefore, I think, as we find in many aspects of our lives, of those of us who have grown up in a changing world, have learned that certain language that we used very naturally in our youth is no longer acceptable. And some blessings in terms of modern society, which perhaps sometimes has gone overboard in other areas, but nevertheless has sensitized us to the use of language. I think Christians need to bear in mind how Jews generally perceive the word mission when it is used in relation to them. And therefore, perhaps to distinguish or to tease out the inner words within that mission as reflected in the document. So I think if a Christian were to say, it is essential for me to witness to my faith, that sounds different to a Jew than saying, it is my responsibility to bring the mission of Christianity to you, or to bring its mission to you. So I think that sensitive language is important, and certainly in Hebrew. In Israel, and amongst Hebrew-speaking Jews, the word mission, which is of course a transliteration of mission, is unquestionably an anathema. But if you were to use instead the Hebrew word, which actually is the more correct translation of the term shlichut, which means the emissary coming out, sending forth, witnessing in effect, I think it would be heard very differently. So finally, I think we have to take semantics very seriously and tease these out together so that in our communications, we use language that is heard and therefore can be resonated with and does not serve as an obstacle. Thank you very much.
Rabbi David, thank you very much indeed. And there are, as yet, no questions of clarification. We're busy digesting all that both you and Bishop Michael have said, and very much appreciate that. We hang on for the discussion questions. We welcome now Sister Teresa Brittain from the home team in Prestwich in Manchester, Roman Catholic congregation of the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. She studied theology at King's College in London and a Master of Literature and Theology at the University of Birmingham. And she's also worked on the integration of the new relationship with the Jewish people with Roman Catholic catechesis. She's on the advisory board of CCJ and also a trustee. Our Lady of Sion are a wonderfully international and intercontinental religious order. And Sister Teresa is widely travelled and much in demand as a retreat giver and an educator on many continents, not just here. And we asked Sister Teresa to reflect on the Catholic experience of facing up to the difficult history with Judaism and the Catholic response to that, which Rabbi David has also outlined in part of what he said now. Sister Teresa, if you were to unmute, and here we go.
Right, there we go. So I feel a bit, yes, a bit abashed to be following on those your two presentations. And I want to make it a personal story, really, in a sense, because when I read the document, I realised how we come from a completely different perspective within the Catholic tradition. And I'm speaking of our experience as a congregation of our Sisters of Our Lady of Sion, who after Nostra Aetate were given the specific task of carrying this forward within the church. And the Catholic Church, because of the type of constitution that we have in a ecumenical council, is huge. And I, even just looking at the history of the development of Nostra Aetate, it was a complete war battle, because you had cardinals who came from the Arab countries, you had cardinals who came from all parts of the world, and many of whom did not see that they wanted this, and they certainly didn't want anything to do with the Jews, if possible. So the fact that this document, Nostra Aetate, was born was because of the persistence, really, of people behind the scenes, and that had been going on for a long time. And particularly within the Catholic tradition, it was very much the biblical scholars. We had some wonderful biblical scholars, and they are the ones who carried it forward. Therefore, when we read what Nostra Aetate says, and it was quite good for me to have to look at it again, to tell you the truth, it really it starts from a theological perspective. So what it's interested in is the mystery of the church, and it then moves into the relationship with Judaism in the light of the mystery of the church. So it situates it right in the heart of the Catholic Church. So therefore, when we've approached it in the last 50 years, that's the position that it's the starting point, if you like. That has made a big difference, because it's made the difference of looking at theology, looking at scripture, looking at, as well as the political things. But the political things have always been more on the edge, partly because we're too international to be dealing with all of that. But the heart of the church is the faith thing. And I've got just a little bit of thing from David Rosen. When you were here in Manchester, which you probably remember, you called it a silent revolution. And I thought that's a wonderful image, because it's true. And I think the revolution is a bit too silent at times. And I think there are people who've never even heard there is a revolution. And that's the reality. The revolution has started and is rolling, and it's rolling very strongly. And it has been rolling strongly. Why? Partly because of the popes that we've had and their leadership, partly because of the theologians and this committee that they set up. The Catholic Jewish Liaison Committee was set up, and there were some wonderful materials that came forth from that. And also because of the guidelines and the notes that followed on from Nostra Aetate, which were the practical orientations. Now, one of the things I loved in the document of God's Unfailing Word is the practicality of it, Michael. And I suppose because it speaks particularly to the English context, I found it quite refreshing and much lighter to read than a lot of our stuff, because our stuff is being translated and, you know, flashed out and all of this. But it comes over much lighter. But I do think that our congregation in particular, Mary Boyce, you probably know Mary, she's a theologian in the States, and she made a whole study, her whole life really has been Jewish Christian, but she made a study of our congregation because she said the changes that we have undergone are the changes that Christians will undergo if they take this seriously. And I want to say that it's a painful journey. It's a very painful journey, because as we've said in the God's Unfailing Word, there's a terrible history to face. And personally, I've really felt the pain of it in the speaking and everything else. But also the whole congregation has, because in a way it changes the rooting of our Christian identity. We've had to shift. We've had to shift from a position of embattlement, which was there really before Second Vatican Council, and a church that knew everything and was true and everything else, something that is much more nebulous and much more true and much more real, and where everything can be examined. I mean, Pope Francis is now talking about a synodal, I don't know how you pronounce that, but the synod. He wants to have a synod rather than the structures that we've got, our hierarchical structures. And the opposition's phenomenal. I mean, the opposition that poor old Francis is getting is phenomenal, because we have been stuck. We were stuck in an image which was, I don't know where, it's historical, and it needed to shift, and it was a big shift, a very big shift, but it started slowly and the ball has been running. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of some of the background, and I wanted to say that I think it's Cardinal Casper who says, you know, it's a slight, it's a step, it's only a step in the beginning. And I tell you, when I was been thinking about this, I was thinking the verdict on the George Floyd thing in America. There's a great joy about it, and there should be, but the tip of an iceberg. And he's just a representation of a structure that's at a level of consciousness which has to be examined. And I think that's the image I get for what has to happen. And I think in some ways we've had to start examining it. And when you start it, you're changed. Your eyes are changed, and you can't go back to what you were before. And as someone said to me, it's really painful, you know. I said, I know, it is, it's painful. It's painful because you hear things. Like Mary Boyce was saying, she went into her local parish church and she sat down, and the priest started his homily by saying, Jesus was the founder of the Catholic Church. And she sat there and she looked around her, nobody else blinked. But she knew what she felt. And that's what you live with. You live with this knowledge that everything has shifted. And once it's shifted, then other things have to shift. And that has to happen within our theology, in our supersessionism, in you know, replacement theology, in how we deal with the scriptures, everywhere. So the notes and the guidelines begin to open some of this. And the difference in the notes and the guidelines from Nostra Aetate is it's very evident that there has been dialogue with Jewish people in the preparation of them, because there's a wonderful statement that says the Jewish people have to be understood in the way they describe their own identity, not in the way we think they are. I always remember one of the rabbis here saying he went into a primary school and the children were very disappointed. They expected him to be like Jesus and be in sandals with a prayer shawl and trailing dust, you know, and we've got to move on from that. And that's where a lot of people are, that image. We haven't come into the relationship with Judaism as in reality. So there was a document that came out in 2015, which was called, and I'm sure you know the title, the theological, what was the exact title?
The gifts of the are irrevocable.
Right, that's it, are irrevocable. And we've done a lot of work on this whole thing of covenant. Is it one covenant? Is it two covenants? How many covenants is it? Is there multiple covenants? And in the end, I mean, I think one of the things that's very important at Nostra Aetate is the Romans 9 to 11. The fact that they took that text and they used that to try and understand and recognize that they couldn't. That's part of this. You have this in God's Unfailing Word too. Divine mystery transcends the theological norms. In other words, it is a divine mystery. So this whole thing about how Christians, and I like the way you said, David, about witness rather than mission. I think that's where we've come to. We have to stand in the what is it? Rabbi David said. You know, we have wait a minute, assimilation and integration. We have to integrate into the society, but not be assimilated, because we need to stand in our own individual identities. And we have to witness to who we are. And we are, as Christians, this. And you are, as Jews, this. And what we do in relationship and in dialogue is we actually enable each other to grow in their own individual identities. And I think that's a little bit of what you've been saying, but it certainly would be my personal experience of dialogue and would be the experience of ourselves as a congregation across in other areas. I just wanted to say the thing about the complementarity of the two traditions, which again is mentioned in the you probably know this much better than I do, in the exegesis. When I work with Old Testament and New Testament, it's amazing how, although Marcion was rejected, how Marcionism is so strong. And for our priests as well, they often avoid the Hebrew scriptures. When I've given little retreats, I've been amazed that somebody would come to me and say, I really appreciate the way you use scripture. Because I don't separate, well, I do separate, but I have a continuity of them, and one doesn't take precedence over the other, but one cannot be understood without the other. The New Testament cannot be understood without the Hebrew scriptures, which fortunately, the institutional church did recognize at the time. So it's the complementarity. Help one another mine. Pope Francis says we need to help one another mine the riches of God's word. And that's one of the areas that is so rich and so exciting and so wonderful and changes our perspectives. And that's beginning. I mean, I've had experience of it. People, if they want to have it, the experience is there. So I'm sorry, I'm roaming a bit, which is the way I normally do when I'm rushed for time. It is to, the document emphasizes that the universal salvific significance of Christ must be shared with all peoples, and that Catholics are to bear witness to their faith in Christ, also to Jews, but the Catholic Church rejects, in principle, any specific institutional mission directed at Jews, because Jews are already the bearers of God's word. And it's that thing of we are siblings, we carry the word, and we carry the word in different ways. Because we are siblings, we are of the same, I won't go into all that history, that complicates it, but we are the same root. We are the same root. And in being in the same root, we have to also work with the differences. You know, my brothers and my sisters are different to me, but they're my siblings. And that gives it gives a completely different shift and experience. I'm no longer outside, I'm within. And I think that's part of what has to happen within our Christian experience. In other words, a person who is preaching has to feel that and has to address that. So speaks from an inner being that is in relationship with, and not over and against. And as you said, the complementarity. And I think just a couple of practical sort of things that I've seen, shifts that have happened, and I think they're really, really important, are the way that personal relationships have altered the dialogue. The fact that John Paul II had personal friends who were Jews in Poland and knew about the Shoah. The fact that John the 23rd was in Turkey and knew. All of that has had the repercussions. The fact that Francis has worked with Rabbi Skolka in a practical way, as well as a theological way, in Argentina long before he became Pope. All of that makes a difference. And it's when it's happening there, at the grassroots level, if you like, that things will shift. And they have shifted. I mean, I was telling a group the other day, I had to laugh because when I first started talking about Jesus being a Jew, when I was teaching, I remember the parents coming to me and saying, "Sister, you are telling my children that Jesus was a Jew." He wasn't a Jew, he was a Catholic. Now, when I say that, they laugh as well. Catholic groups laugh when I tell them that. And I think, well, we have moved. We've moved a bit. Everything is slow. And I think that's where we have to have patience, I suppose. The first goal for Catholics is to come to know Jews more profoundly. One can only learn to love what one has gradually come to know, and one can only know truly and profoundly what one has come to love. And I just, that for me is the essence of it. I think the other thing is we spoke there about the covenant and about God's fidelity. For me, it all comes down to our image of God. What sort of God do we believe in? Do we believe in a God that would cut off a people? Do we believe in a God that would... What sort of God do we believe in? And for me, a lot of this dialogue is, how do we together witness to the presence of God in our lives? I've just been, this afternoon, I was at a thing, it was a Muslim who was speaking. And one of the things he was challenging us to is that the future lies in interfaith, but interfaith in practical ways. We can do things together. That's wonderful. But it also lies in praying together. While acknowledging that some of the Christian prayers cannot be said, Christians can pray with Jews without any problem. It's how do we work at a deeper level within ourselves, because that's the only way that anything will change. It won't change by the surface, it'll only change by the depth. Just as the whole Black Lives Matter thing is not going to change unless we change. So I think that's where I wanted to leave it, but I wanted to also conclude, this is the conclusion. And this is from 2015 document. It concludes with the citation from Pope John Paul II's speech to the Conference of Rabbis in Mainz in 1980. And I love this. He said that Jews and Christians, as children of Abraham, are called upon, and this is to be a blessing to the world. By committing themselves together to peace and justice for all peoples, with the fullness and the depth that God intended, and with the readiness for sacrifice that this goal may demand. And I think that's where I want to rest. But also I want to bring in creation in this, because I think Jews and Christians, we should be also involved in the whole, which also is very much the inclusion of creation. And that's where we are.
Teresa, thank you. Keep your microphone open. There are no questions that come through on the chat yet. We hope to finish the session at 7 o'clock this evening. I know that some people have joined us late, and I can assure the folks who have joined us late, who have had to slip away while we're broadcasting, as it were, there will be a full recording available afterwards, so you won't miss anything. Now, we do have a very interesting question that has come up on the chat, if I can scroll it down, from Dr. Philip Cunningham, who joins us from the United States. Philip, you're very, very welcome. I read the question out, folks, to you. I hope no one will mind if I get into some Christian theological weeds a little. Let me ask in rather coarse terms whether, from the perspective of Christian concern, Jews are not saved, in inverted commas, by virtue of their intimate covenantal relationship with the saving God? Question mark. I hasten to add that its logic is not equivalent to a problematic dual covenant position. So that's Philip's question. Do we want to, should I just go through that again for you?
Steve, we can't hear you very well.
Okay. Well, I know Philip is actually here. I wonder whether, Philip, if you'd like to unmute and share your question with us. Philip?
There we go.
Yep.
Like a second. Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad to be with you, and hi to all the folks I know here. It's great to see you all. On the topic of the debate with not debate, but the critique of Rabbi Mirvis about the discussion on mission, and also drawing from some of the comments that Teresa and David made. I want to ask a question from a rather coarse or basic Christological understanding of salvation as being the be-all and end-all of Christian concern, whether or not the very fact that Jews are in such an intimate relationship with God that we call it covenantal, and that's acknowledged, I think, in both the Church of England and in the Catholic, Roman Catholic communities. Doesn't that sort of automatically mean that they are quote unquote saved, depending on what one means by that, by virtue of the relationship itself? Or maybe to put it negatively, how could someone that's in a covenant with a saving God not be saved by virtue of that covenantal relationship?
Now, Rabbi David or Bishop Michael, Sister Teresa, if you want to have reflections on that.
I'm happy to say something, but I think Bishop Michael should speak first.
I was hoping you're going to keep me muted, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's lovely to see you.
Likewise.
I think because I'm an Anglican, I want to give three brief answers to that, if I may. The first one is, I think the underlying philosophical question about is the question, are you saved or not, the question that we should be asking in interfaith relations. I mean, I think that's a kind of wider issue, but you've asked the question, so to take it on board. I think secondly, then my personal response to that would be, yeah, I don't have a problem if we're going to use the language of salvation and forming judgments on whether other people outside in other communities are saved or not. I don't have a problem with that logic at all myself. I mean, I think it's quite compelling. That's me as me. The third answer, I suppose, is as a bishop in the Church of England and the person who chaired the group who produced this report, I think that is one of the views that sits within the range of views that we recognise within the Church of England, but not everybody would agree with it. So that's where we get into. I see Ian, I think, asked a question a little bit later about should the range of views in the Church of England be narrowed. Well, maybe it should, but that's where we are at the moment. I think it's a view that one can recognise within the perimeter of the Church of England's theology, but it's not the only one.
I would only presume to add, as this is really not a question for I think the Jewish partner in this dialogue, but I would only choose to add that on the basis of that conversation I referred to with Pope Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger, I think he would say to you, Phil, yes, Jews are saved, but they can't get the whole way. In other words, they can't get the whole caboodle, because that only comes through faith in Jesus. I think that's what he would say.
Now, we have two questions about friendships and building relationships with the Jewish community. Tom Griffiths asks, how can Christians define or redefine their relationship with Jewish people if they don't know anybody in practical ways, except for celebrities and television? And Lisa Batty wants to ask a question about friendship pairing. If I can invite Lisa to unmute. And Lisa, if you'd like to share your question with us. Right. I hope the technology...
It's okay, right? It was just I was trying to alert Francesca to unmute me. Okay. No, I want to just be quick in the sense that because not enough people can meet personally and enjoy the friendship of a Jewish person, maybe there's a way of progressing this. I'm going to use the words urgent duty, a la Jules Isaac. Thank you, David. Because I mean, really seriously, well, this is not something we can leave. This generation needs to get on with this, progressing our understanding of this. But maybe instead of us, if you like, hoping for more Jewish people who would befriend church leaders, what we could do is befriend church leaders who are much more aware of the interaction and the mutual interdependence of our faiths, to befriend new church leaders who want to ask questions, because people like myself can always signpost folk on to Jewish people we know if necessary, and that way we could spread it more quickly.
Thank you.
Can I just come in for a minute there? That's Lisa, because my sister is in the Philippines, and in the Philippines they have a very small Jewish community in Manila, and that's it. And they are working very hard now, because in Africa and in Asia, there aren't Jews, not many. So the way scripture has been and the way the missionaries have taken the Christian message, we really have to work with that. And we have to, and that's where our theological change has to come. Because otherwise everything gets perpetuated. They don't never meet a Jew, and that Jew's an enemy, and look at the way the scripture is, etc. So we're really working very hard at that. And I just want to tell you, there was a wonderful bishop in Manila called Bishop David, who actually gave a homily about a month ago in his cathedral about the fact that Judaism is our root. And he did his studies in the Biblicum in Rome, and he's a biblical theologian. He's a wonderful speaker, and it was a marvelous thing to have a bishop stand up there and say that. So in that sense, I do feel that things are beginning to filter through. But it has to come both from there, but also from the grassroots.
I have a question from Guy Wilkinson. Guy, it's lovely to have you with us on the call. Would you like to unmute and have a particular question for Rabbi David, which I'm sure he'll enjoy?
Got it. Yes, well, it's just been wonderful to hear Bishop Michael and Rabbi David and Sister Teresa. Really helpful, and I think, well, after all these times when we've not been able to meet so much, to be able to see each other at least on screen is a blessing. So thank you. I mean, there are a million questions that we could raise for the panel, but I'm just picking up on David, your point about witness as a better language than mission, which I entirely agree with. And you won't be surprised to know, Bishop Michael, that within the group who were writing this document, there was about the same spectrum as you would find in the Church of England more generally on most of the issues that we discussed. But I suppose behind the question of mission in relation to Christian-Jewish dialogue is a kind of wider question for many within the Christian churches, I mean, of what it might mean for our relationships with other religions if we were fully to say, as I probably would, that, and following the Catholic position that at least institutional mission is not appropriate, but I'd probably go further than that. But that does then lead me to ask, well, what is my position in such matters in relation to Islam or the other religions?
Yeah, that's perfect. Great.
Oh, amazing.
Great. Well done.
Wonders at the mystery of technology. So the truth of the matter is I really shouldn't have held you up on this, because I was saying how delighted I was to be able to see Guy, and it was worthwhile being on this webinar for nothing else, just to have the pleasure of connecting with him. But of course, it just adds to the pleasure and the joy of this event. But his question is really not for me, is it? It's really for Christians. It's not really for me. But nevertheless, from my point of view, I mean, I don't have, from a Jewish perspective, I don't have any problem with accepting the idea of multiple covenants. There is no limitation for me in terms of that. In fact, I think that's what the prophet Amos is saying in chapter 9, which we read as the Haftarah, the additional lectionary on this Shabbat from the prophets, where he says, behold, the children of Israel, are you not to me like the children of the Ethiopians? Did I not take out the Philistines from Kaftor and the Arameans from Kir? In other words, God is to be found in the history of all peoples, and the potential for covenantal relationships are there for all. There is no exclusivity in that regard. Because I can say that because Judaism doesn't claim to have a monopoly on tickets through the pearly gates. You could say once upon a time we did, and we've done transformation. Okay, but today we don't. So I don't face the challenge in the way that the Christian faces the challenge. Yes, I think it would certainly be far more effective for Christianity to utilize that language for everybody. But I'm not sure that Christians, all Christians could adapt that, but I think they could do it far more easily in relation to Judaism than they can for other religions.
Thank you. That's a perfect introduction to the sacrament of otherness, and the way in which the Christianity relates to Judaism is the template for how Christianity relates to all otherness. And so, Bishop Michael, is there anything you'd want to say in a final response to that? We're coming towards 5 to 7, and we promised you that we would finish the meeting at about 7 o'clock. And I appreciate the sign of a good meeting is we want to go on, and we've only really begun in so many ways, but this has helped set an agenda for future meetings and for future engagement, for which we're very, very grateful to everybody who's taken part this evening. So we're going to invite Bishop Michael first to respond to Rabbi David, and then invite Rabbi David and Sister Teresa to give closing thoughts before we finish this evening.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, in terms of that particular issue, I think you, Steve, have just said what I was going to say, that it is, in that sense, the Christian-Jewish relationship is paradigmatic, not just exceptional, but paradigmatic of how we could relate to people of other faiths. And I think the sense of mission as mutual witness is deeply persuasive for me, and I think what we should be exploring. In terms of other things, could I just say two things? Thank you to both Rabbi David and Sister Teresa for their very rich expositions. I mean, Teresa, in relation to the magnitude of the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England is, you know, a flea to an elephant. We are very diminutive, and I think it's very interesting that an organisation as big as the Roman Catholic Church was able to produce something as focused as Nostra Aetate and all that flows from it so much earlier than we, with our relatively small size, have been able to produce something just a few years ago. David, I'm very grateful for all the nuance of what you've said about mission, about complementarity, which I think kind of echoes, from a Christian point of view, the thought of James Parks, of course, was huge in the formation of CCJ, and so many other things. And I recognise, thank you particularly for pointing out the lacunae of no reference to some of the very significant Jewish documents on Jewish-Christian relations. My hope is that, and I think the hope of all of us who've been involved in God's unfailing word, is that this will in some sense be a living document, not just a text set at one particular time. I'm not particularly suggesting or looking forward to the idea of producing a revised edition, but I hope that in some sense we can gather a continuing body of reflection around it that will take forward a lot of these issues and the particular points made tonight. And can I just say one other thing, and then I will shut up, in relation to Lisa's question, and I think others, of how we've actually developed Christian-Jewish meeting when it's quite difficult in practical terms because there aren't enough Jews to go around, to put it crudely, on the ground. What are we doing tonight? We're doing this online, and I think CCJ certainly, and I think lots of other dialogue organisations are just beginning to think, what are the implications of doing things online, and how much does that open up for us in a way that we never thought of before? And I think this is one area where that could be quite transformative.
Thank you. Sister Teresa, closing word. Oh, says you need to unmute.
I'd echo what Bishop Michael said there. I've just been fascinated during the pandemic how many things have gone online, and how many people you can reach and which countries you get to. And for many people, interfaith has become important, very, very important. I mean, Robin here has a conversion class for her synagogue, and I've cooperated with that this week. So that was fascinating, really. So I'm just so delighted that this is possible. And I think one of the things we've got to realise is how much we've travelled in the years since Vatican II. But Michael, I also so appreciate in a lot of ways, the smallness of the Church of England is very attractive as well, believe me. It's, when you, especially as a woman within a structure like ours. But I think that, and Rabbi David, I'm just very, very grateful for being with you tonight. And I'm very grateful for the fact that we've done this. And I think, like Lisa, we have to continue, David, the other David, with the Julie Zach and the his work, because he's so important. And I just wanted to do a little salva, because Mary Boyce is going to do a lecture for us with the Cardinal Bayer in June, and she's calling it the teaching of respect. Because one of the things that we do now is, instead of the teaching of contempt, you do the teaching of respect. And certainly now within the Catholic schools, the children are studying Judaism as a second religion. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for the evening, and thank you for all the work.
Rabbi David Rosen, I give a closing word to you.
So anything I had thought to say when you invited us, Steve, has virtually been said. But you know the WAG, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. I love this idea of the teaching of respect, but may I suggest that there's still a shade beyond that. And that's what we have to ultimately aspire for. And that's the teaching of celebration. When we can really celebrate one another as true partners in true complementarity, see the beauty in one another, then we've arrived. And I'm of course reminded of Krista Stendhal's famous 3 rules for interfaith engagement, which I'm sure you all know, but allow me to repeat them. And the one, of course, has already been articulated in terms of the Catholic Church documents in relation to Jews, and always seek. But his rule is not just in relation to Jews. Always seek to understand the other the way the other understands herself. And the second rule is always look at the other group by the best that was within it. Don't judge it by the worst. But his third rule is leave room for holy envy. It's a beautiful concept. It's wonderful when we discover what we have in common. It's really important to be able to share what we have in common. But there is nothing in any way disloyal to your tradition, to be able to something really beautiful in our tradition, and to be able to celebrate that beauty, to be able to rejoice in it. And I think that's what we have to aspire for interfaith relations generally, but specifically in our unique relationship, rooted within our shared scriptural and shared perception of our theological history, while respecting those differences. I also want to resonate with the 2 particular points. One is the point of friendship, and it connects to the issue of technology, as indeed Bishop Michael just indicated. In the discussion before, there are places where the transformation in a Christian-Jewish relationship is particularly successful. generally that is where the grassroots connect to the Olympian heights. And what I mean by that is where theological teaching has the sociological conditions to make it easily absorbed, there you have a success story. And the most obvious example of that is the United States of America, where you have vibrant Christian and Jewish communities along one another, and particularly the Catholic-Jewish relationship, where you have all of them see themselves are minorities, essentially, whatever identity the United States has collectively, nevertheless, all religious communities are minorities. And yet, they see themselves as part of the overall society. And there you have vibrant communities, very often cheek to jowl, and there you see the amazing transformation. It's wonderful that we have Phil online with us, because Phil's done a study in terms of teaching within Catholic schools. And of course, the earlier one was done by Rose Fearing. And you can see how the Olympian heights have been internalized in the grassroots. But then there are parts of the world, the vast majority of the world, not just parts of the UK, the vast majority of the world where there are no Jewish communities. The Jews don't even feature on the radar screen. And there very often I come across bishops from these places, talking about the Catholic Church, I've come across Catholic bishops who don't know the content of Nos Pietate. I have to tell them what their theology is. And because it's not because these are people that are in any way negative in relation to Jews, it just doesn't feature, it's not relevant. So that becomes the big challenge. How do we make the relevancy of our relationship expand beyond the context that we are specifically engaged in? And that again comes, as precisely Bishop Michael said, to the wonderful blessed tools that we've discovered during this annus terribilis that we have discovered, nevertheless, are incredible gifts, and that we have to be able to leverage and maximize them, not just Zoom, but of course various YouTube facilities and various recordings that we have, where these kind of discussions need to be able to go out, but we need to, of course, be able to utilize the technology that is appealing to young people. And mostly that's not long-term discussions. I could just give you a little illustration as a young rabbi here who's just produced short YouTubes introducing in Arabic Judaism to the Muslim world. Those kind of things I think are very important, to get little short vignettes and be recorded and disseminated about Jewish-Christian relationships, that they can go out therefore to the broad cross-section, society of ages and of geographic context. That I think becomes the imperative for us if we are going to take the Olympian heights to the grassroots of the world.
Thank you. And on behalf of the people gathered together tonight, eyes meeting across a crowded Zoom, David Arnold as our co-chair for the Manchester branch of CCJ to deliver a brief vote of thanks. So thank you to our speakers for this evening.
Well, thank you, Steve. And what a privilege it has been this evening to listen to our three speakers, Bishop Michael, Rabbi David, and Sister Teresa. In a sense, Bishop Michael had the easier task in that he had a text to speak to. But I'm so grateful that I've got a recording of the whole event so that I can explore the richness and the nuance both of his presentation, but especially also Rabbi David's presentation and Sister Teresa's reflections too. It really has been a privilege to hear all three of you, and I'm looking forward to listening to it all over again. Sister Teresa said that really this is part of an almost silent revolution, and I think the task that remains for us now is where so few of our rabbis, of our clergy and of our congregations are familiar with this work, which 100 years ago would have been inconceivable. How do we open this up to all of our congregations and communities? But finally, on behalf of everybody who's been present tonight and had the privilege of listening, can I say how much we appreciate and how much we have to be grateful to Bishop Michael, to Rabbi David, and to Sister Teresa for a truly wonderful and insightful evening. And I look forward to hearing and seeing you all again very, very soon. Thank you.
Well, that concludes the meeting in a formal sense, and it's normally at this stage in a CCJ meeting that I would say, let's have just a short pause together. Let's do that together now. Just have a short moment of silence before we leave. Then I say shalom. Then I say safe home. I try and remember the Gaelic for safe home, but of course, we're already there. And that's one of the joys about meeting together like this. Thank you so much for everybody for taking part tonight, and also giving us an agenda for the year ahead.
Yes.
God bless.
Well done.
So this is formally over. And we will be in touch with all of you who've been here this evening, and very much appreciate your being with us now. I won't close the call just yet, but we are officially formally over. So good night, God bless, and safe home. Though it's to the kitchen.
Oh.